when she went down, he went down, and he was screaming really loudly. And I thought, what is he screaming? What happened?
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Rust lead actor and producer Alec Baldwin did himself no favors going on to ABC News about 3 to 4 days ago, ostensibly to control the narrative. Has he controlled it, or has he kicked up a hornet's nest? Well, he may have gone on the show not wanting to portray himself as a victim, but he would have wanted to portray himself in a way that would have benefited him, such as by courting public sympathy. And sure enough, there was the appearance of grief, contrition, and remorse. But when asked if he felt guilty, without so much as a pause, he said he didn't.
Do you feel guilt?
No. I feel that there is, I feel that.
Why wouldn't he feel guilty? You don't have to be guilty to feel guilty, but in a situation like this, you would imagine someone would feel guilty. They did something by accident or through whatever, and someone lost their life permanently. It's a huge tragedy. And through whatever circumstance, him picking up the gun led to someone losing their life. Don't you feel guilty about that? And Baldwin didn't just say that he didn't feel guilty, he said someone else was responsible. Was someone else responsible, or was the person who held and fired the gun responsible? This analysis highlights the top 10 what the Fs in Baldwin's ABC interview. If you're new to this channel, if it's the first time you're hearing my voice, I'm a prolific true crime author of over 100 books. I've written about some very high-profile cases such as O.J. Simpson, Jodi Arias, the John Benet Ramsey case, and many, many others. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So the number one what the F for me was where Baldwin described meeting Helena's husband, Matt. And this is what he says.
I didn't know what to say. He hugged me and he goes, I suppose you and I are going to go through this together, he said. And I thought, well, not as much as you are,
So in case you missed that, Helena's husband, Matt, hugged Alec Baldwin and said, I suppose you and I are going to go through this together, meaning the sort of grieving process. And Baldwin responds that he thought something. He didn't respond by saying something. His response was to think, well, not as much as you are. And there's actually a slight smile when he says this. And if you think about it, that's a hell of a disclosure to make. And I'm not sure if it's true given Baldwin's trajectory right now. I don't think Matt will be facing court cases or potential reputational damage the way that Baldwin is. It may be fair to say that Baldwin's life may change a lot more than Helena's husband's. He also says on camera that he told Matt he didn't know what to say. Well, couldn't he start with, I'm really sorry? Incredibly, when he does go through this scene with Helena's husband, he hardly talks about it before he reverts back to himself. He doesn't really describe much about Helena's husband or much about that moment. It reverts very quickly back to himself, back to his family and his kids, and him emphasizing how well things are going. There doesn't seem to be much space or effort for simply observing and absorbing her family's pain. It all seems to be about him. It feels shallow and superficial. It feels a little narcissistic, doesn't it? And that brings us to the second what the F, the 911 call. Now, in an emergency situation such as during a 911 call where lives are on the line, and they were here, there's usually no BS. It's a BS-free zone as long as what is being said is genuine. During the 911 call, the operator asked the obvious but almost rhetorically obvious question.
So was it loaded with a real bullet or one? I cannot tell you that.
So the voice you heard there was Mamie Mitchell, the script supervisor, who was standing right beside Helena when she was shot. And she responded to the question, was it loaded with, real ammunition? And she said, I cannot tell you that. Not, I don't know. but I cannot tell you. And yet she knew enough to say that Helena had been shot accidentally. In fact, I think she said the word accidental more than once. And so there's often a problem in an emergency call where you're explaining the circumstances in terms of the plot, not so much the scenario that is kind of played out, in at face value. You're already becoming defensive. That is usually not a good sign. In any event, the script supervisor, Mamie Mitchell, is another one that is also suing Baldwin. That brings us to the third what the F, the last to know, question mark. Was Alec Baldwin really the last to know what had happened? Baldwin said that he stood over her, meaning Helena, for 60 seconds. And it is quite interesting how seldom he refers to her by name, refers to anybody by name. And basically, 60 seconds sounds like a long time. It's not really a very long time. It's 1 minute. It's not a very long time in a situation like that. But it's long enough to figure out what's going on. 5 or 10 seconds would be enough to figure out. And so ABC's George Stephanopoulos asks, was she conscious? And Baldwin pauses because now he's got to actually think about what he saw. He's got to remember her lying there. And so Baldwin pauses and then answers carefully, my recollection is yes. Quite a guarded answer, isn't it? And there's some distance in that answer. Was she conscious? My recollection is yes. And that's it. That's the end of the description. Nothing is said about Baldwin attempting to render aid, talking to her, trying to attend to a wound, being distressed, being apologetic, panicking, being concerned, noticing something coming out of her. Instead, he jumps forward 15 minutes to when the cops arrived and then circled the church in crime scene tape. What happened in the intervening 14 minutes? Is it just blank? And so when he says she was in the church, Baldwin scratches the back of his head, a sign the behavior panel have highlighted as a sign of huge stress. And I have no doubt the producer did suddenly feel the burden of what had happened weighing on him then and now. The question is, what burden was that? Was it a burden of actual responsibility? Was it a burden of guilt? Or was it the burden of reality that he didn't really want to face? For me, one of the biggest whoppers, if not the biggest, is this moment where Stephanopoulos asks, no one told you what happened? And of course, if no one told Baldwin, who's he seems to be a reactive, reactionary, assertive and opinionated fellow, he would never have known. If someone didn't tell him, he would never have known. He would have never have made up his mind. He would have never volunteered to try and find out. His thinking would never have gone in that direction. He would never have drawn his own conclusions. And so this is the moment.
Are you sure you want to hear this?
No. It wasn't until I was in the police station, hours later, the idea. And finally, one of the police officers at the conclusion of my interview, I was there for like an hour and a half or so, no one had any idea until that police officer, that sheriff's officer said to me.
So I have quoted what he said here, but I've also edited certain amounts of fluff out where he talks about aliens and other things. And so basically what he says is, it wasn't until I was at the police station hours later and finally at the conclusion of my interview, and no one had any idea until the police officer said to me, that's what they took out of Joel's arm. In other words, that is how he understood what had happened. Baldwin is somehow the last to know what has happened to Helena, and he only seems to figure it out once he's shown on a policeman's phone and told. This is because it's completely incomprehensible that she could have been shot when you'd imagine that would be everyone's first assumption within the first 5 to 10 seconds, perhaps even within the first 1 to 2 to 3 seconds. And I've been in a situation before in terms of researching other cases where people like Amanda Knox, Oscar Pistorius, Jason Roeder, in terms of the death of his wife Susan, Rebecca Zahau and many others, they are always the last to know that the person that is actually in their custody is no longer alive. They've got to be convinced. Someone's got to tell them. Another example is John Benet Ramsey. The last person to realize what is going on seems to be John Ramsey, really. Now, if you take this case, Alec Baldwin, I mean, there's a gun in your hand, a finger fiddling with the initiating mechanisms, a bang, a recoil that you can feel, a bang that you can hear and feel as well of the weapon, someone crumbling down to the ground instantly at that moment, and then someone else injured at that same moment as well, and probably a smoking gun afterwards. So you've got a smoking gun in your hand, but I have no idea what happened. And then hours later, I still need someone to explain it to me. I've got a smoking gun in my hand, someone lying down on the ground, 911 called, emergency services called, but I need someone to explain to me what has happened because I've got no idea. And that is really incomprehensible. And the other thing that I think is quite interesting is if you take Baldwin as a person, as a character, as a personality, wouldn't you say that he's an assertive person? And at the beginning of the interview, when asked why now, he says he can't wait until February or March for a police report and can't countenance others weighing in on his case. And so what has he done? He's taken charge. He's sort of made this interview happen, and he is going to take control. He's going to take control of the narrative. He was also the producer of the film, in charge, in control, one would think, of the set, of the setup, and of quite a lot of the people there. And so he's a take-charge personality, a controlling character, some might argue, and yet on the question of what he did, he's as passive as a lamb. Would you be, in a situation like that, would you be, you know what, I'm going to wait for someone to inform me what the situation is. I'm not going to try and find out. You know, the stakes are really, really high. I'm going to leave it to someone else to decide what they are, right? Is that realistic? So someone must explain to him like he's in kindergarten and he's a very passive person. He's not going to react. He's not going to take control. Let somebody else do that. Even the 911 operator with precious little information, within seconds, thin sliced the situation the way everyone else did. She said, so was it loaded with a real bullet? And that's exactly what it was. And that brings us to the number 4, what the F, where Baldwin says, I thought she fainted.
Around nothing. She goes down. I thought to myself, did she faint?
So do you remember when he embraced Elena's husband and he thought to himself, well, you're going to go through a lot more than I am. And yeah, you have another situation where he separates himself during a critical scenario and he sort of gives us an aside. There's the sort of dramatic aside. So he basically says, she goes down, and not I said, I acted, I did this, I did that. Instead, he's introspective. I thought to myself, did she faint? Would you, in an emergency situation like that, stay sitting and just be thinking? Or would you leap out of your chair, leap out of your position and try and do something? Most people would. So why are you thinking and passive in this situation? Why are you still thinking and passive? Why not ask her, did you faint? Are you okay? Or ask someone else, or verbalize something. What is going on? Is she okay? Get up and find out. What else is there to do? And bear in mind, in his version, a minute goes by where he's standing over it. Does he say her name? Does he touch her? Does he look at her face? Are her eyes open? Is she breathing? What are other people doing? Is he asking someone else what is going on? Or is he just standing there like a statue? Or is he there but just not there? Is he blank? Is he passive? Most people in an emergency aren't passive. And who faints realistically on a cowboy set, in a cowboy movie, at the moment a gun discharges, when gunshots are part of the fabric of cowboy films? You wouldn't expect that to happen when everyone on set is used to the fabric on set. Once again, another thing to highlight, he never mentions her name. She goes down. Not Helena stumbles back and falls to the ground, or Helena collapses, or Helena crumples, to the ground, or anything about the look on Helena's face. Number 5, 1 billion bullets, 1 billion to 1 chance. So Baldwin makes a statistical argument that about 1 billion bullets have been fired over the past 75 years, and so actually the fatalities are quite low, given the arsenals that have been discharged. I'm not sure what he's really driving at here. I think he's sort of confusing and sort of muddling the issue. But it seems like he's minimizing it, saying somewhere in those stats of all the bullets that have been used, there have to be casualties, and there are casualties, and there have to be statistically, but it's very few, and it just happened to be me. It's incidental. It's accidental. Well, is it? Number 6, is he victim blaming? ? It's a question. In Baldwin's version of events, as he explains it, Helena directs Baldwin where to aim the gun, and Baldwin merely complies. So once again, he is passive. He doesn't do anything at his own volition. He's not. Think about what an actor does. An actor acts. An actor's got to perform. Sometimes they've got to improvise. But in this case, he needs to be told everything he's got to do. And so let's look at these words. He says, she's guiding me through how she wants me to hold the gun for this angle. I'm holding the gun where she told me to hold it, which ended up being aimed right below armpit. I cock the gun, I go, can you see that? Can you see that? Can you see that? And then I let go of the hammer of the gun, and the gun goes off. The part I want to emphasize is where he says, she wants me to hold the gun. I'm holding the gun where she told me to hold it. And so in a weird way, she's responsible for what happens to her in his version of events. And so I think the important part in the spiel is whether Helena asks Baldwin to fire the gun at her. So he might be correct. I don't know what the other crew members would say about that. But if Helena asks Baldwin to hold the gun, does she ask him to actually fire it at her? And the answer technically is no. Listen to what he says next.
So then I said to her, now in this scene, I'm going to cock the gun. And I said, do you want to see that? And she said, yes.
So at this point, he is actually making suggestions, right? At this point, he's kind of taking the lead and saying, do you want me to do this? And she says yes. But the vital point is, at no point does she ask him, fire the gun at me, right? And what happens next? Well, Baldwin does this at his own initiative. Let's listen to what happens next.
So I take the gun and I start to cock the gun. I'm not going to pull the trigger. I said, do you see that? She goes, well, just cheat it down and tilt it down a little bit like that. And I cock the gun. I go, can you see that? Can you see that? Can you see that? And she says, and then I let go of the hammer of the gun and the gun goes off.
Now, I think it's very interesting how matter-of-factly describes this part. It's the most, you would think, tense, emotional, distressing part, a part that should affect him, and yet is very, very matter-of-fact about it, right? And anyway, the point that he says is, then I let go of the hammer of the gun, and the gun goes off. She didn't direct him in that respect to say, okay, let go of the hammer of the gun, right? So why wouldn't he stop aiming at her, right? So in other words, he's done the angle check at her direction. After all of that, why wouldn't he stop aiming at her and then let go of the hammer? No one asked him to fire. No one told him to fire. And they're not shooting, as far as I can see, they're not actually shooting the scene. So he needs to go back to the original position for them to shoot the scene with the hammer back in the original position, right? So wasn't it his prerogative to do what he did while the weapon was aimed at Helena? It certainly wasn't hers. She didn't say, fire at me, right? And it's a question. Was it his prerogative to do what he did, or wasn't it? And that brings us to number 8. And this is just my interpretation, my opinion. It seems like a sneering retort to George Clooney. Now, I do wonder how Baldwin really feels about his peers. Think about someone like George Clooney and the way the public perceive him, and also George Clooney's career. Would you say George Clooney's had an above average career or below average? Is George Clooney's sort of the score that he gets out of 10 in terms of how much Americans admire him and like him and the kind of movies he's made, compare that to Baldwin, especially lately, and are they on the same level? Who is the more respected actor? How does the one actor feel about the other actor? How does the other actor feel about, how do they feel about each other? And so when Baldwin is asked to respond to George Clooney's comments, you get another sense that he's not a wallflower, he's not a shrinking violet, he's not a passive person. There's a little snip, there's a little snipe in his tone. There's a little bit of contempt possibly in how he says what he's trying to say.
You have if your protocol is you check the gun every time, well, good for you.
So it's very subtle and it's very quick. Some could argue it's not even so subtle, but there does seem to be a bit of taunting there. You can hear a slight inflection in his voice where his speaking tone is quite husky. He says, if your protocol is you check your gun every time, then he says, well, good for you. And there's a slight inflection in his tone. As if the words, well, good for you, could actually mean something else. But there is definitely a sense of indignation and even opprobrium aimed at George Clooney here. It's also not a very nice way of saying something in response. I think if Baldwin felt genuine remorse, I think he would have genuinely observed that he wished he had done that he had observed the sort of protocol, that he wished he had checked like others in the industry do, that he could have and should have done better. Well, good for you is a bristling response, and I think that's a good word to describe Baldwin's attitude to the whole debacle. He's bristling. Baldwin is thinking and worried about number one, Baldwin, isn't he? Number 8, don't damage the firing pin.
Of my instruction in this business, people said to me, never take a gun and go click, 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 because even though it's incremental, you damage the firing pin on the gun if you do that. Don't do that.
So what are we talking about here? He's told not to go click, 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 but he volunteers in a way to pull the hammer back, and what does he do? He actually fires something. Just compare those at face value. It's probably not a very good argument but I'm no gun expert, but the notion that someone might say, don't pull the trigger, you might damage it, to me is like saying, don't start a car, you might damage it. I mean, that is what it's designed to do. It's the quickest and most obvious way to figure out whether the gun works or is safe. And for goodness sake, these guns aren't meant to go into a war with or to be used on the front lines by police officers or criminals. I don't think they have the sort of life that a lot of other firearms do. I don't know if they are used that much. I could be wrong. And is it so expensive to replace something like that? Is it? I don't know. It just seems a little bit silly to say, don't do that. Are they going to use that set piece in a different film? Maybe. But if you have the situation where the mechanism is so fragile, then you would think there would be no question about him actually pulling the hammer back. It would be, oh, please, it's almost like a museum piece. You might break it. Please don't do that, right? And so the idea is that guns are meant to be used just like cars are meant to be driven. They're not museum pieces. You handle them and then you use them. That's the point. You don't handle them in order not to use them. You don't get into a car in order not to drive it. You don't get into a car and sort of not know that it's got fuel, not got fuel in it or got fuel in it. Those tend to be things you figure out immediately. So the ninth, the penultimate what the F is intertextuality. For those new to me, it's the pattern that you find in one criminal case typically that corresponds with quite a lot of insight to another criminal case. And so there was a rumor, which has since been disproved, that Baldwin, when asked to do another take, jokingly pointed the gun at the cinematographer and the director cried, and then he cried, "How about I just shoot the both of you?" Right? And this has since been, it's not true. But I think what is quite interesting about this bogus quote is that it resonated with the sort of jeering, joking, assertive, indignant personality Baldwin can be. You know, he's kind of an over-the-top, extroverted guy, and perhaps also somewhat reckless in certain ways. But that didn't mean it was true. So although it resonated, although it felt true, it didn't mean it was true. But I do remember thinking, wow, that does actually sound like what happened. But it turned out that isn't what happened. So if Baldwin does have a case to answer for, and it's becoming increasingly evident that he might, bear in mind there were other accidental discharges, and when you have enough accidental discharges, then is another one really so accidental? And if his version of events isn't completely accurate, something else that was mentioned were the not very good or not very strong safety measures in terms of COVID. And that just is giving you a general, you might say that's irrelevant. That is giving you a general sense of attitude to safety, or whether you say, you poo-poo and you say, that's not for me, you know, we are more important than these annoying protocols. We're not going to be mired down by them. We're not going to kind of be caught up in these sort of webs of red tape. We'll just do whatever we want, kind of thing. It feels a little bit like that. So, you know, if Baldwin does have a case to answer for, I do think it's becoming increasingly evident that he might. And if his version of events isn't completely accurate, how does he expect his version to succeed? Does he expect his version to go unopposed? Well, think about it. He is the producer of the film. He is holding many of the chips, isn't he? And if he can go onto ABC, it's like a loud trumpet. It's like a voice ringing from the rooftops. People that have a different version of events are going to not have quite the reach and influence that he's going to have. And people are going to remember what he said more than what smaller little voices elsewhere, perhaps on social media are saying. I must say this case does feel very intertextual to the Jason Roeder case, a case that happened in South Africa, where you had a property mogul, a CEO. So the guy who was at the head of the business killed his wife in a hotel room. He was convicted for that. And this was actually during a business convention. So quite similar to being in a movie where you've got a lot of your employees or staff running around, and someone is paying for those staff members, and it's all everyone is working towards a common cause, right? And so this property mogul killed his wife in a hotel during a business convention. So a lot of his staff members were all staying in hotel rooms, adjacent to his, and filling up virtually the whole hotel kind of thing. And so it was a business convention held by his company at that same hotel. And so you might ask, how did he expect to get away with it? And the answer is, one possible answer is, well, most of the witnesses were his own employees. It's quite a unique situation. He's the one holding the keys in a way. He's the one holding the power. He's the one that's got quite a lot of control under the circumstances. And I wonder whether the person who called 911 wasn't told what to say. I don't know. But I wonder whether that's going to come out, that the person calling 911 was told what she was supposed to say. I'm speculating. I don't know what the answer is. But that being just one example of presenting the narrative of what happened in a certain way compared to what did really happen compared to reality. And so that brings us to the 10th and final what the if. I did as I was told, right? And this is kind of the theme that comes throughout his interview with Stephanopoulos. I did as I was told. I was a good boy. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't know I did anything wrong. I'm innocent, right? And so I think Baldwin's story seems to be that he's a passive player. That's kind of what I'm harmless. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm not reckless. I obey the rules. I'm a good person. And he's told by others what to do in terms of protocols, in terms of everything. I've mentioned earlier that Baldwin, I don't think, is a passive personality. I could be wrong. But here is a test. And this was raised in some comments on a separate platform. Listen to this. And these aren't my words. It's something someone else said, which is, I think, an excellent test for what we're talking about. Someone made a point asking if the scene in this film had required Mr. Baldwin to hold the gun to his temple and simulate firing. Would he have checked the barrel? What do you think? So I'm not going to take it further than that. If you are enjoying the content of this channel, please subscribe. I will be putting up the next Moab incident. I think it's deep dive number 3, dealing with the Gabby Petito case, the Moab incident. Look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.